after a little bit of investigating, I managed to find a complete list of all major Game Award shows on Wikipedia. So I was able to look at the vast array of titles that were on this list, everything that won the Game Award from any one of these shows in existence. And I noticed a fair few things. First of all, how many of these games that have been completely forgotten? Like, who do you know who thinks that, like, oh, THQ, they were killing it in 2006? You know, I saw some IGN article claiming that THQ was the publisher of the year that year, only to go bankrupt by 2012. Okay, like it's really interesting looking back on games like Prey. You know, back when they were trying to hype up The Elder Scrolls 4, right? Well, when they were trying to downplay The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, right? The best-selling Zelda game ever at the time, right? I looked at like IGN's list and realized it wasn't even nominated because like, ooh, The Elder Scrolls. Like again, Game of the Year does not and never has meant anything among any publication. Okay, let's get that out of the way right now before we go into like Game Award season this year because this entire process is a joke and needs to be thought of as such. You know, game journals have no credibility whatsoever to actually talk about anything of value. So the other thing I really wanted to bring up, and the reason I brought up this list to begin with, was to kind of compare notes. You know, how many awards did Twilight Prince, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom win compared to Baldur's Gate 3? You know, how close was this? Did Tears of the Kingdom win more awards? Did Baldur's Gate 3 win more awards? Like, who won more Game of the Year awards in 2023? You know, I looked at the entire list, I calculated it, and Baldur's Gate 3 won 11, and Tears of the Kingdom won 9. So, first of all, like, even if you're looking at it, like, purely numerically, like, it's a lot closer than people like to make it out to be, right? Plenty of people preferred Tears of the Kingdom. Plenty of people played Tears of the Kingdom. It was a success story. In an ideal gamer society, you know, every game that was nominated for Game of the Year would be considered a masterpiece. But we don't live in an ideal society, okay? We live in this corrupt shithole, this wretched hive of game journal lies and coping and seething, and that really needs to be brought up because looking at this list, it kind of dawned on me just how one-sided the Baldur's Gate 3 thing actually was, right? When you look at like the award shows that are giving out these awards, you begin to notice a really odd trend, right? Where the actual gaming outlets, you know, the people who actually cover video games, who actually play a lot of them, who actually have gamers on their staff, they, generally speaking, lean towards Zelda, right? The people that were giving awards to Baldur's Gate 3, right, they were stuff like The Guardian, BAFTA, the Game Awards, the DICE Awards, right? Like, all of these things that really gave this impression that all of these awards were being given out by purely ideological reasons. And you can actually look back on their history of giving out awards. And for a lot of these organizations, you see a lot of very obvious blatant shilling, right? You see awards being given out to The Last of Us Part 2. You see, like, no-name indie games being nominated. You see, like, really obvious progressive stuff, like pushed in front of way better games that came out that year, right? You notice a trend. And when you compare it to like something like the Famitsu scores, right? When you compare it to Edge, right? You get, in general, much better games. You get games catered to a Japanese audience. You see stuff like Monster Hunter and like Animal Crossing and other Zelda games, right? Like you don't see a whole bunch of just nonsense, right? Like you do with these corrupt Game Award shows. And that is what this boils down to, really, is that the award shows that gave out awards to Baldur's Gate 3 and games like Alan Woke 2 and everything else that came out this year, like came out that year, like they are not award shows that have any credibility whatsoever. Like, why exactly would you care what the Game Dev Conference has to say about anything? These guys are complete and total frauds. You know, they don't produce anything. They're not gamers or game devs. Like, why exactly is Baldur's Gate 3 so spectacular? Okay, like, why exactly is this better than Zelda? Not a single person has ever really been able to adequately explain why without some vague assertion that, like, well, you can do whatever you want. I played enough video games to know that whatever that expression is said, it's just a cope. Okay, you know, I heard that being said about, you know, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, about Elder Scrolls 5, about like you know, Cyberpunk 2077. You know, so many games that these kind of people try to push to the forefront and push as like the biggest names in gaming, when in reality they really can't compete with anything that Nintendo is doing. And that's the trend with Baldur's Gate 3. This is like Witcher 3 versus Breath of the Wild all over again, right? Where Witcher 3 is considered this like huge hallmark dark fantasy series, like the biggest export in Poland. It's this masterpiece of storytelling, and you're completely ignoring the fact that like it was based on a book, it was plagiarized, they took a lot of liberties with the source material, even in the games, which nobody seems to notice or care about. You know, people the games themselves aren't very well put together. The combat system is lame. Like, the plot lines are poorly thought out. You know, like, before The Witcher 3, they weren't even really AAA. And yet you're supposed to believe that The Witcher 3 is some phenomenal IP. Like, oh, man, it's the greatest thing ever. CD Projekt Red is the greatest dev in the industry. And then they put out Cyberpunk 2077, and now they're, like, the absolute zeros of the industry. Nobody has any faith in them whatsoever to deliver any kind of product. And yet we're still going through this song and dance of just like, well, Cyberpunk was saved though. Like, they're gonna make a comeback, guys. No, everything they've said and done over the past decade or more points to the exact opposite. There will be no return to form for CD Projekt Red. They will never again reach the heights they did with The Witcher 3. The Witcher 4 is going to come out, and it's going to be a complete broken, buggy mess. Like, it's gonna be the Witcher equivalent of Mass Effect Andromeda, right? You're gonna have like a bunch of ugly women thrown everywhere. All of them are gonna be gay, and like I don't know, like Ciri's gonna be the new protagonist, and the plot is gonna tell you that like, oh well, Ciri's better than Geralt ever was. Oh, girl power. Oh, and they're gonna like unlock the secret to lesbian sexual reproduction or something. Like, it's gonna be woke, and it's gonna be bad. It's gonna be embarrassing, and you're gonna see a bunch of people try and come out and defend it, just like they did with Dragon Age, just like they did with Cyberpunk 2077. Like, even now, you can't really say anything bad about Cyberpunk 2077, and that had one of the most disastrous launches in recent memory. You know, this is the current state of the gaming industry, is that these people aren't capable of discerning between high quality and low quality. I do not trust them to tell me what is and isn't good, to the point where I don't even really pay attention to them at all. You know, like, I've said this several times. I don't read game journals. I don't follow their news. I don't follow their nonsense. You know, like, whenever they try hyping up something like a Untitled Goose Game or Celeste, I just roll my eyes, ignore it, and the game is not only forgotten in 5 years, like, all the sequels and the follow-ups, the DLC just fall apart immediately after that, right? Like, it's kind of crazy how Celeste is getting a follow-up, and yet nobody who loves Celeste is really bringing it up or talking about it at all, right? You know, Celeste was always a complete and utter joke. You know, Hades was always a complete and utter joke. It was just something propped up by game devs, game journos who were trying to prop up their friends in the Western woke industry, right? That's all this was. That's all Baldur's Gate 3 was. Whenever you see Swen do this thing where he's just like, oh, I want developers to treat their employees better. Like, not once did I hear any like game journal point out the fact that Nintendo does that. Like not once do I hear like anybody even acknowledge, Nintendo's history of treating their employees incredibly well. Iwata, that legendary story everybody knows, Iwata slashing his paycheck and the other executives to keep people on board. If anything, I've seen people try to introduce narratives to downplay that, like saying that like it's required by Japanese law to do that, when completely ignoring the fact that Nintendo has plenty of employees overseas, right? Those were the people that had their jobs threatened, and Iwata took the pay cut to protect them. Okay, like again, every time people come up with these narratives, these conspiracies, they're very easily debunked by even looking at them even a little bit. And I think the Baldur's Gate 3 thing is a really good example of that, because this is not an IP that's going to remain relevant for a long period of time. People can cope and see all they want, like D&D invented fantasy. Tolkien used to sit in his basement with the other Inklings, right? Like him and C.S. Lewis made up the stories for Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia through their D&D campaigns. They can try and gaslight you all they want about that, but it's not true, okay? Like D&D has not really left much of an impact on fantasy at all. And Baldur's Gate 3 is not going to leave much of an impact on video games. I think it's very clear for people who have actually spent time playing the game and experiencing it. They know it's not that great. They know it's not some game changer. They know it's just some basic CRPG with woke elements that was being propped up by game journals in order to push an agenda, right? They know. Like 10 years from now, Tears of the Kingdom will be acknowledged as the far superior game. That's the one people are going to remember. That's the one people are going to look back on. Like I was thinking recently, Twilight Princess. I remember when that came out, how that was a huge hit, how that like drove a lot of early Wii sales, how like everybody loved it. And yet you saw a lot of people trying to deny it was a great game. And at the time, I think fans were going along with it because there was this mindset that it was too similar to Ocarina, and Ocarina was better and it was more influential. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? Ocarina is the best game of all time. But when you actually think about it critically, like Twilight Princess has had a far more interesting and enduring legacy than something like The Elder Scrolls 4 did, right? It's gotten a really successful tie-in manga. It's gotten sequels. It's gotten all these crazy spin-offs. It introduced all these iconic characters, right? There are elements of Twilight Princess that have gone on to establish themselves as being some of the best ever in the Zelda IP. And what does, like, Oblivion have? I don't know. Like some people will try to tell you it's better than Skyrim, but like they probably just grew up with it. Like again, The Elder Scrolls could never compete with Zelda, but yet that was at the time something that people were trying to prop up. Just like people are trying to prop up Skyrim now. Just like people tried to defend Starfield initially before it completely collapsed, right? These games will keep getting pushed until gamers start rejecting them, until people start noticing the problems and start pointing things out. I think the big issue with Starfield, the reason why so many people fell off of it so quickly, was because at its core, it was no different than Skyrim. It had the gonky, like, character models, the poor animations, the poor writing, but it's so big though, you can explore an entire universe. Yeah, I did that in No Man's Sky, and it was boring. That's the thing about modern gaming, is that it doesn't matter how big a world is anymore. It doesn't matter how many quest lines you have if nobody wants to do them. It doesn't matter like how many guns you have if everyone just defaults to the best weapon. It doesn't matter like if how many Game of the Year awards you win if people just completely forget your game exists. And that's going to be what's going to happen to Baldur's Gate 3, is that it is worshipped by its niche audience, but among real serious gamers, it was forgotten a long time ago, to the point where we're going into this year, knowing that there's never going to be a sequel, there's never going to be a follow-up, that this has been just a complete train wreck, and I think more importantly, Zelda is becoming more and more of an established brand. We are getting a movie. We have gotten a sequel in Echoes of Wisdom, which was not which was not downplayed to the same extent that Tears of the Kingdom was. And we are going to get new Zelda games on the next piece of Nintendo hardware. And I ask you, like, what exactly is Baldur's Gate 3 going to do to compete with that? There's nothing they can do. All they can do is just do what they've always done and just move on to the next shiny Game of the Year contender, which will immediately be discarded when it's time for the next shiny model to come in the following year, right? The only purpose for these award shows is to gaslight people into thinking Nintendo games aren't as popular or successful as they actually are. And that needs to be understood going into the gaming award season of 2024.